Hello everyone. Welcome to the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm Lee Berger, a professor in paleoanthropology here at the university. I'm also an explorer at large for the National Geographic Society. Because of the extraordinary circumstances occurring around the world due to COVID-19, we at the university decided to do something special. We decided to give you a behind-the-scenes tour of this extraordinary fossil hominid vault. Inside of this vault are some of the most precious fossils related to the origins of humankind. We hold here something like over 50% of the entire record for human origins known on the continent of Africa. It's a very special place. Only scientists generally get inside of here, but over the next several months in a series of lectures, I'm going to be taking you on a tour of the collections and special hominid fossils and some of the special historical artifacts related to those that we hold here. These will be original fossil hominid demonstrations, and I hope they're of some interest to you and also of some use in those that are having to do classes around the world via mediums like this. Now, I apologize up front because due to the exceptional nature of the events happening, I'm having to do all of the filming, all the audio, and all the editing myself, so it'll be a little bit rough around the edges, but I hope you enjoy. And so, to begin with, before we look at the Taung Child itself, let's talk about where the Taung Child was discovered. Taung is located about 400 kilometers or 250 miles to the west and a bit south of Johannesburg. It actually forms on what's called the Kalahari Escarpment, and it's a huge tufa flow. Now, tufa is a thing that forms actually when water at normal temperatures, they're super saturated with calcium carbonate, flow over cliffs or sharp edges, and they deposit the lime in huge deposits. And the Taung site itself really is an enormous deposit. The bedrock behind it's dolomite, that's where the calcium carbonate comes from. And the tufa has formed was a rich source of lime. And so a few years before the discovery happened, somewhere around 1916, 1918, the Taung site opened as a quarry site to serve the need for lime in the building industry and in the gold industry that was booming around Johannesburg. And so miners began blasting this huge tufaceous deposit. And when I say huge, it really is. It's almost 2 kilometers or just over a mile long, this deposit, and probably almost a half a mile or more in places wide. So it was a really rich source of lime. The miners were blasting away through this, and sometime prior to 1924, the quarrymen began discovering fossils, and one of these fossils ended up in the quarryman's head office. And in 1924, a director, and actually visiting director of the Northern Lime Company, and that's, by the way, where the term Norlem comes from, and you'll see that on the maps as we look at the site, which just simply stands for Northern Lime Company, saw one of these primate skulls and actually asked for it. That was given to his son, Pat Izod, and his son put it on his shelf on a mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was then that one of those great coincidences happened. A young student named Josephine Salmon, she was a medical student, and in fact she was the first female medical student of the young professor Raymond Dart at the University of Witwatersrand, was friends of the Izods and visited and saw this primate skull. Now, she knew that Raymond Dart, a comparative neuroanatomist, was intrigued by skulls, and so she asked if she could take it to Dart back in Johannesburg, and she was allowed to. It ended up with Dart, and Dart was intrigued by it and contacted both the Izods and then the Norlem Lime Company to say if they found any more fossils, could they send them to him. That started off a chain of events that would make history, of course, because a young geologist, a consulting geologist for the company, made a collection of some of the more interesting fossils, at least he thought, that had been discovered at the Tong Quarry on a visit there. And he boxed them up into a big wooden crate, and he sent them to Raymond Dart in Johannesburg. And they arrived in Dart's home in November of 1924. And it was ironically the very day that Dart was going to actually serve as a best man at his best friend's wedding. And there was evidently much consternation with his wife as he opened up the box and started sorting through these things. And that's when he saw a remarkable block. Before we get to the Tong Child itself, let me show you some of the neat things we have here related to the history of the discovery. This is a bust that was made by an artist back in the 1930s. You can see it has lovely flowing locks of hair as a very early attempt at the reconstruction of what the Tong Child would have looked like when it was alive. This object is actually the box that Raymond Dart used to transport the Tong Child when he took it to London, even in the original plastic bags inside of it. This is the box that Raymond Dart blamed his wife for leaving in the back of a London taxicab with the Tong Child in it. It was luckily recovered. I guess taxi cab drivers were pretty honest at that time. And luckily, it has come down through the years unscathed. We no longer transport the Tong Child in this box. It has its own special case that it transfers in when it's not sitting here in the lab in this armored protected case. This block is a reconstruction that was done by Ron Clark back in the 1980s. This is a facsimile, because we have no pictures from Raymond Dart's time, of what the block would have looked like that the original Tong Child came out of. Here you can see what probably Raymond Dart would have seen, which is the back of the skull and what he described as this very clear mushroom shape. And we'll get to that a little bit later, and the bottom of the jaw. So he had a pretty good idea that there was a face inside of this concrete-like breccia block. He would go about remarkably preparing this block from November to around December 21st with a pair of his wife's knitting needles and this hammer, which has remarkably survived. And here's Dart actually using this very hammer. He's preparing what looks like one of the early Makapanskat hominids. You can tell that because he's got the comparison of a Makapan hominid there in front of him. We'll be looking at the sample from Makapanskat in the near future. So as you see, the Tong Child is in three pieces in front of me. It wasn't always like that. When Dart first saw it, it was, of course, part of it was in this block and part of it was loose, and that would be this endocast. This is what it looked like after preparation. After Dart had prepared it with those knitting needles, the face and mandible were actually fused. That would later be taken apart by Philip Tobias, and the brain case was alone. Can you imagine that moment when Raymond Dart, a comparative neuroanatomist, opened up a case that arrived from Tong and saw an endocast? Let's take a look at the discovery itself. The initial scientific announcement of the Tong Child occurred on the 7th of February 1925 in the journal Nature. Now, that itself is remarkable when you consider that he'd only seen the face on the 21st or so of December, and he wrote the paper describing this new species, Australopithecus africanus, austral meaning southern in Latin, and pithecus meaning ape in Greek, africanus meaning Africa, so the southern ape of Africa. And he published it just a couple of months later in Nature. Now imagine that had to go by mail train probably to the coast, then on a ship to London, had to be reviewed and then printed with the methods of that day and published. A remarkable feat by any standards. It's actually not the first publication, though, of the Tong Child, the Star newspaper here in Johannesburg actually headlined the discovery on the 3rd of February, just a few days before. And there's always been some wonder whether that's what pushed the editors of Nature to put the paper out so quickly. Not surprisingly, the announcement in Nature was not received with open, welcoming arms by the dominant British Academy of Scientists, largely led by Sir Arthur Keith, Grafton Elliott Smith, Sir Arthur Woodward, who, not coincidentally, were part of what was known as the sort of Piltdown Gang. They were the people involved with the scientific description of the Piltdown skull. The Piltdown skull had been discovered in England at a place called Piltdown, and it was the exact opposite of the small brain Tong Child. It had a large human-like brain and more ape-like jaws. It would later be proven in the 1950s, around 1953, that the Piltdown was a fake and had extremely biased world opinion on the Tong Child. Now, to give you an idea, the kind of backlash that Dart received for claiming that he had a possible human ancestor in Africa, there were statements like the fossil had little bearing on the issue of whether ancestors of man are to be sought in Africa or Asia. Now, that's coming from the idea at the time that humans had a distinctly Asian origin. Some scientists even went so far as to suggest it was perhaps just a baby gorilla, and that the Tong Child would bear little out on anything other than the origins of apes themselves. Broom did have his supporters, though. People like Robert Broom came forward. Philip Tobias used to tell a lovely story of Robert Broom bursting into Raymond Dart's lab, his office actually in Hillbrow Hospital here in Johannesburg, and falling to his knees in front of his ancestor. I think these were all extraordinary characters at the time. Eventually, the Tong Child and the fossils that had been discovered by then from places like Kromdraai and Sterkfontein were recognized for what they were. The big moment, scientific moment, if you will, came when Wilfrid Le Gros Clark, who perhaps is one of the leading scientists in this field of comparative evolutionary biology in its early days, in early 1947, said that he felt that the fossils from southern Africa did bear direct bearing on the ancestry of humans. And in February 1947, there was an anonymous paper, interestingly, published in Nature that told of Wilfrid Le Gros Clark's January pronouncement that the Tong Child was indeed a hominid. And literally that day, Sir Arthur Keith recanted his position and said that he had been wrong the entire time. A remarkable thing for the sort of stuffy nature of science, and particularly English science at that time. So let's start by looking at what Raymond Dart would have first seen. The first thing that he really noticed when he opened up that crate arriving from Tonga was this endocast, and it really was a remarkable thing that Raymond Dart was the recipient of that, because Raymond Dart was a comparative neuroanatomist, and probably one of the few people in the world that would have recognized the real significance of this specimen. Now, firstly, what is an endocast? Well, an endocast is actually a mold of the inside of a skull, and it preserves potentially features of the external morphology of the brain, because as you are alive, your brain is effectively beating and molding an impression of the outside of its surface anatomy onto the inside of your skull. The younger you are, like the Tong Child being very young, the better often those sulci and gyri are preserved. As you get older, it tends to smooth out a little bit as the skull hardens and other things happen. Now, to explain what happened in this particular case, because you have half of an endocast here, I brought along a chimpanzee skull to sort of illustrate this for you. So here you have the skull and the face of this chimpanzee. It's clear that the Tongcha was lying on its side, something like this, and sediment from the cave infill that it was in entered the foramen magnum. This is this hole right here that your spine attaches to. It began to fill, but only filled halfway. So we kind of know where the floor level was, and when it passed, it didn't fill up. So it was probably relatively dry sediment that initially filled it, but that sediment would soon harden by lime. That would then preserve this just magnificent endocast. Now, one of the first things that Raymond Dart noticed was this area down here, which is what he interpreted as the foramen magnum itself, the position where the spinal cord enters the skull. Now, that's a really important area because, as we go back to our chimp friend here, in quadrupeds, and chimpanzees are quadrupeds, when I put the skull in something approximating the sort of Frankfurt horizontal position, which is about like this, in quadrupeds, the foramen magnum is oriented slightly backwards because the animal walks on four legs. In the case of chimpanzees, of course, they knuckle walk on four legs most of the time. And so the foramen magnum, if this was from an ape or a monkey or something very small, would have had the foramen magnum positioned towards the back. What Raymond Dart saw or interpreted was that this foramen magnum was actually very far forward in the position when you put the skull in its anatomical position of orienting straight down like this. So he interpreted this as indicating, even though it was a very small brain, that this was a biped. Now, that was remarkable. No one had ever seen a biped that had a small brain like this. All the discoveries to that time in 1924 had shown large brain hominids. The Piltdown man, which of course was going to be a fraud, had a huge brain. The Java finds of Pithecanthropus or Homo erectus had very large brains, but here was a very small brain. And Dart could estimate the brain size very easily by dropping this into water and effectively doubling it, although, as you can see from this line, it's not a perfect a half of brain. You actually have a little bit more, indicating the skull was positioned downward sloping in the back a little bit, but he figured that the brain size was between about 400 and 500 cubic centimeters, so at least about a third of the size of a modern human brain, which was very tiny. Now studies have indicated, more accurate studies have interpreted that this brain is likely around 400 to 410 cubic centimeters in size. So very, very small, with an estimated adult size, that is, of course, this is a child, and we'll talk about the age of that in a moment, that would grow up to be approximately 440 to 450 cubic centimeters. The size of a little bigger than a chimpanzee's brain would be that you see right here. So this endocast is beautiful and remarkable. And I just want to point out some of the features. And by the way, the science of examining these endocasts is extremely difficult, and scientists argue about the morphology of these things all the time. But here's some things you can see on it. Back here you can see beautifully the cerebellum. There's a huge argument over where the lunate sulcus is, but most people think it's this feature that's right down in this area right here. The frontal sulcus is likely down in here. And so you can begin to interpret the anatomy of this. I just want to also take one quick look at the beauty of this specimen. I still think it's one of the most beautiful fossils ever found. I don't know if this light does justice to seeing the calcium carbonate crystals that flash there as you look at the calcium carbonate crystals that formed like little stalactites and stalagmites on the interior of that skull. Remember that this was blasted free by dynamite and is lucky to be in this condition at all. Here's a good look at that mushroom-shaped feature that Raymond Dart saw and was able to correlate with this feature, of course, as I demonstrated earlier, this feature that he saw in the back of the block. After working with the hammers and chisels and knitting needles, this magnificent face emerged. Can you imagine what Raymond Dart thought when he saw this face? Now, as I said, remember that the face, he didn't have a view of the dentition at the time, but he could see the sides of the teeth. And from that, a couple of conclusions were made. One was that this had a very small canine. Even for a juvenile, this female chimpanzee, you can see, has a relatively large canine. He could tell immediately that this had a smaller canine, again, a sign of humans and other hominids even at that time. He felt that the enamel was thick, and he could see a couple of broken areas on here that indicated that the enamel was actually thicker than you would see in a chimpanzee. And that's another character of being a hominid. We have very thick enamel. As we look at this magnificent face, you can see a couple other things. As I look at the jaw, you can see that the jaw is not curved like you would find in a human. A human would have a broad, open U type shape. This has a very parallel shape, which is a primitive condition, but not as extreme as what you see in chimpanzees, for example. So again, something leaning towards the human or hominid side. So let's take a quick look at the dentition of the Taung child. These are all deciduous teeth, so we have deciduous central incisors and lateral incisors, the deciduous canines and molars. This is a permanent tooth here coming in, the M1, the permanent M1. When you combine that with the dentition of the bottom and do modern studies like micro-CT scans of this, there have been age estimates done that place the Taung child at about 2.5 to 3.5 years of age at death. So here you can see the magnificent fossil, and here you see the jawbone. They were, as I said, reunited originally, and I'll do that for you in just a moment. I just want to point out something interesting that's sort of a tragedy that has occurred with this specimen. You can see that the teeth have gaps between them. Those gaps have actually occurred from scientists measuring this with metal calipers over the years. We can see from the original photographs of the Taung child that in fact its teeth were in much better condition now. So we no longer allow calipers like that to be used on a specimen like this. Some other characters of this specimen: it has a very small frontal lobe, and you can see here that it's not as developed as in humans. So what I'm going to do now, just as a fun exercise so you can all see this done, my mentor Philip Tobias used to do this with great glee, and I'm going to do it for you. So we're going to put all this back together and reunite this in a way that hasn't been done for a very, very, very long time. So first, we now have reunited the face and the endocast, and I will give you a look at that, the classic image of the Taung child itself. And then let's see if we can get, without doing too much here, the jaw aligned. And there we can put the jaw back together like it has been when it was discovered. And here you can see now the jaw on the Taung child. It's an interesting thing about this specimen is that we don't really know the location from where this specimen was discovered. Surprisingly, even though he recognized the importance of the Taung child, Raymond Dart didn't go immediately to the Taung site to actually explore and see where the fossil skull had been discovered. Alei Herlichka was one of the first to go shortly afterwards, several months afterwards, in fact, to the Tong site. But all we really have are some grainy pictures that were taken after the fact, often several years after the fact, with quarrymen who are indicating about where the skull came from. But it was pretty much consensus from all those early visitors that the actual site where the skull was found had already been blasted away and destroyed. Attempts have been made over the past many decades to locate the actual site. Philip Tobias thought he had located the site and actually put a pyramid up at the site. People like Jeff McKee felt that the areas, the two pinnacles, one called the Herlichka Pinnacle, one called the Dart Pinnacle, were not the area that was actually outside of that. Excavations were conducted. Many baboon fossils come from these pinnacles, and here you can see a very good image by Kuhn et al. Of the areas where people think that the fossil skull came from, but no one really knows. So there are many questions we might never know the answer to because we don't know exactly where the Tong child came from. But there are some questions that we think we can get close to answering. And one of those is, how did this little child die? Back in 1994, I was excavating alone at Gladysville one day, a hominid site I discovered a few years earlier. And I was watching a troop of vervet monkeys playing together on the hill opposite, and suddenly they started alarm calling, and a black eagle came around the side of the hill, and they were watching it and running from it and leaping from tree to tree. But what it was really an ambush, because almost immediately a second black eagle came from the other side of the hill, swooped down, and grabbed and killed almost instantly a large male vervet monkey. I was stunned. I didn't realize that large eagles like that were real predators of primates in that way, or at least I'd never thought about it at that time. And as the eagle watched me, I watched it, and then it did something even more amazing. It lifted this monkey, which must have weighed 2 to 3 kilograms, say 5 or 6 pounds, and flew down the valley, carrying this monkey off in the direction of its nest. Now, I knew where these two eagles nested, and so I got in my car and I raced over there, and I climbed up underneath the nest, and there I found a bunch of bones, skulls of monkeys, skulls of hyraxes, a small daci, a mammal in Africa, rabbits, bird bones, and all of them had these very characteristic marks. And almost immediately, my mind went to marks that I'd seen on fossil baboons from Tong. And I'd been pondering what the cause of the collection of the Tong fossils were. They're very different than almost anywhere else. The ones directly associated with the Tong child, at least from the original box that Raymond Dart had recovered, were all relatively small and dominated by primates. Raced back to Wits, I opened up the drawers that held these monkey skulls, and there were the same marks. I was stunned, these keyhole-shaped type marks. And that would lead me to work with Ron Clark. At the time, we would publish in 1995 the hypothesis that a bird of prey had actually killed and eaten the primates that were alongside the Tong child, and possibly the Tong child itself. Well, a little bit later, work by scientists in Central Africa on the prey of the crowned eagle, a much larger, ferocious bird of prey capable of killing animals up to, say, 30 kilograms or 70 pounds, and carrying off very large prey as well, showed other marks, including marks that were in the orbits of the eyes of these monkeys. And when I saw those images, I was actually asked to referee a paper. I was blown away, and because I realized that I'd seen those images too. And I actually went down late one evening to the vault at the University of Witwatersrand. It was then in the medical school, pulled out the Tong child, and there were those same notches in the orbit of the Tong child. And I knew that really we had the culprit for who killed the Tong child. So let's take a look at them. Let's take a look at some of that evidence for what we interpret as predatory damage by a large bird of prey. I think for me, one of the most striking is this damage that occurs inside of the left eye socket. There you can see these very jagged little areas in a very thin piece of bone. Now imagine that in the base of that orbit, that bone is paper thin. For it to even have lasted is incredible, but that is very characteristic of how large birds of prey even today will go after a primate skull. Probably the chicks are doing this more than the adults, trying to get into the brain, because of course the brain is sitting right behind there, and also just worrying for other parts of the meat that they can get to. Across the surface of this skull are these scratches, and some of them I believe you can even see, even in this light from this distance, scratches all over the surface. Again, a feature that is very, very characteristic of damage that's done as eagles feed on the meat of the face with their talons and with their beak. Philip Tobias, when we first came up with the idea of the Taung Child, immediately ran in and grabbed the Indocast again, because he and Raymond Dart had always puzzled over this area right here. That may not seem like much, but it was an anomaly, because what you can see across here and here are impressions in the bone, and maybe this part is actually better. You see this deep impression that we can see here that's got actually bone pushed down into the brain. That had confused Dart and Philip Tobias for a very long time, but of course that's a very characteristic kill point for large birds of prey. These large birds of prey, like the crowned eagle, have talons that are sort of 14 centimeters, or kind of 6 inches in length, and they're razor sharp. And because primates are so dangerous, they have hands, they can grab onto the legs or wings or feathers of these birds. They try to kill them instantly, and they actually have killing talons that they drive into the brain, and they leave exactly this kind of mark on the skulls of monkeys. And so with that evidence, and the evidence of the monkeys that we actually discovered, and the nature of the deposit and the damage on those monkeys themselves, we interpreted that the Taung Child was killed by a large bird of prey. So the final thing to talk about is, how long ago did the Taung Child live? And the answer is, we simply don't know. We don't have the site anymore to directly date it. So we have to make estimates using the baboons that were found with it, as well as where other specimens of Australopithecus africanus have actually been discovered, like Sterkfontein and Makapansgat. And from that, we estimate that the Taung Child lived between 2 and 3 million years ago. But until we can direct date this fossil, we may never know for sure. Well, that's all for this lecture and fossil show. I'll be doing others over the next weeks and months on things like Makapansgat and the Osteodontoceratic culture, the Sterkfontein fossils, fossils from Swartkrans and Kromdraai, modern human origins, and of course Sediba and Naledi. If you want to see any particular ones, you can just follow me on Twitter at Lee R. Berger, and you can actually message me there. Please like and share, or follow me on Facebook at Prof. Lee R. Berger. I've enjoyed talking to you today. The Taung Child, the holotype of Australopithecus africanus, now has to go back into its secure facilities. Everyone out there, be safe, be healthy, and remember, keep washing your hands. Goodbye from Johannesburg, South Africa, and the University of the Witwatersrand.